Hello everyone, nice to see you. Thanks very much for coming. There's lots of things you could be doing this evening, but you decided to come to this basement in the Covent Garden, so thank you very much. You obviously know why we're here, but I'm just going to repeat it in case anybody's made a mistake. Probably they're coming to something else entirely. This is to do with East meets West, and we're going to be talking about the collection of John Driscoll. My name is Grant Gibson. I'm going to be chairing this panel discussion for the next 45 or so minutes. Amongst other things, I have a podcast called Material Matters. I implore you all, as soon as you leave, to go onto our podcast and have a listen. I'm delighted this evening to be joined by, going from left or right, even my right to left, we have Ben Williams, who's Philips' international ceramics consultant, Marijke Varrall-Jones, who's the director of Maak, and I'm turning to my left, and you're definitely not Professor Simon Olding, director of the Craft Study Centre. You are Emily Driscoll, daughter of John Driscoll. Thank you very much for doing this at extremely short notice. Good. It'd be quite nice to know a little bit about who we have here. I'm going to take a quick swig of Prosecco before I ask some questions of you. So if we could have a show of hands, do we have makers in the room? I'm staring at a few directly. Do we have collectors? Quite a few collectors. Do we have world-renowned product designers in the room? You can put up your hands, it's all right. We've got to. Very good, so now we know who you are. There's nobody who's here by mistake, just to check. Put your hand up. No, everybody's here on purpose, good. So we're going to talk about John. We're going to put some context to the extraordinary collection that's upstairs, which is, I can't say, I mean, lots of us haven't seen much work for the past couple of years. I walked in and found it absolutely astonishing, completely breathtaking. It's a wonderful journey through, well, studio ceramics from Bernard Leach onwards. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the man who put this collection together. I mean, Emily, I'm going to turn to you in the first instance. Can we talk a little bit about your father and what it was like to live with him and the kind of man that he was?
He was obviously, I mean, he's just an incredible person, and I have pictures of myself like under 1 year old reaching for a pot and them, you know, batting my hands away. So it was just really extraordinary to grow up with these pots, especially when we moved to a small apartment in New York City, and there were hundreds of pots with us at every moment. And I found some archival footage of us recently, and we were dancing around the house, and Dad was filming it, and he didn't seem to mind, so I was impressed by that. But just his love of stories, his love of history, his love of aesthetics, and finding connections that other people, you know, might miss or might not care about as much, and just every detail was so important to him. So that was really special to me, and you know how he would get a twinkle in his eye when he saw a pot that just knocked him back on his feet, or how he couldn't stop thinking about a pot and he would go to any length imaginable to get it. So it was just really special.
So was there a lot of ceramics talk at the dinner table?
Surprisingly, no. It was more like through osmosis that I would get it. He was the kind of person that he doesn't necessarily offer the information, but if you ask him about something, then it's like whoosh. Incredible knowledge, depth, and range, and everything. So yeah, it was very varied. He liked to. He was such a curious person that he was always interested in the other person he was having dinner with, not necessarily talking about ceramics.
And you've alluded to it a little bit, but I'm quite intrigued. I mean, I went to Charles Jenks's house last September when it opened, and it's available. It's open to the public now if you book. And he obviously was an enthusiastic propagator of postmodernism, and his house was like a laboratory of postmodernism. And talking to his daughter, there were certain compromises that had to be made if you lived in that house. Were there compromises that had to be made if you're living with 1,600, I think, pots that John had on display? Well, on display, most of them, all of them?
Yeah, I mean, wherever they could fit, you know, some were, I guess, in cabinets, but most of them were on display. We have lots of photos of them, you know, every corner. shelves everywhere, that any possible wall space was covered. Yeah. But then I have to say, he did find a place in Garrison where he was able to display the ceramics in a place where he always dreamed that they would be, and that was where he was at his most happiest. So it was really wonderful to see him in his element there. The sacrifices, I mean, yeah, he would always just say, pretty to look at, but we don't touch. He would go on journeys to find ceramics, but I didn't really feel like he sacrificed. I mean, he made personal sacrifices because his first ceramics, he took out loans, to purchase like a $130 pot by Liz Fritsch or something, so he did make a lot of sacrifices, but he was very private too, so he kept that to himself.
Yeah. Did you ever smash one of his pots? This is a place we can confess. Think of it as your Catholic. Maybe you are. I don't know. There's an you did. You smashed one of his pots.
It might have happened. I mean, given the amount and volume, I think I did pretty well considering. Yeah.
I mean, can we talk? Bring Ben and Marijke into it. Can we talk historically about how John? You probably know this, but can we talk historically about how John started collecting? I mean, I think there's a moment where he was unpacking crates for an exhibition
with Bill Hull, wasn't he, at the museum? And he was, I think that was the first time that he's encountered pots. But he was talking about the stories that John, loved stories, loved telling stories, loved stories associated with objects. And I think that comes from his interest in paintings and his understanding of the Hudson River School paintings and his understanding as an academic focusing on that particular area, but he applied that to all the pots as well. So I think that the initial response seemed to be just a gut visual reaction, but then much later on he starts applying those same kind of thinking methodologies that he's using with his analysis of paintings, the historical explorations of paintings. He's really going into depth with the collection, trying to fill gaps, working in a completely different way. It was a gut response, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think that it was that kind of 24 British Potters, which was like a really seminal moment for him and started him off in his route of collecting, I think. Like you say, unpacking the crates, ready for that exhibition is where he was seeing all of these works for the first time, before they were being put out to display, having that chance to handle them, that really kind of inspired, like you say, a really visceral kind of gut reaction that this was something that he could get really passionate about. And I think he talks about in the Things of Beauty Growing exhibition, kind of the interview he did with Glenn Addison for that, he really talks about he just was consumed by it. He couldn't stop thinking about the Liz Fritsch in particular, I think, and had to really stretch himself because, on an academic's, a young academic's budget, the price of the pots was beyond what he would normally have been able to go for. And I think, it's really easy to look at the collection now and, the Art of Fire auction that we did, and obviously the East Meets West exhibition upstairs, and we see the prices that were being generated by the auction that we did back in November. But that's not the kind of budget he was playing with at the time when he started building this collection. It wasn't like there was kind of endlessly deep pockets. It was a kind of a 50-year, very slow, gradual process and a very considered process as to how you start building this collection. A lot of it coming from the secondary market, buying up kind of collections, other private collections that had been built, and it was a very kind of layered approach.
And you wonder at what point he decided that rather than collecting the pots that he had an instant appeal, that it became something much bigger, because he very deliberately sought out objects that were not necessarily masterpieces in some cases, but he felt that were illustrating a kind of a development of that artist's work. And at that point, I mean, when you would start looking at the whole movement of British studio pottery, trying to be representative, but also going to great depth, not just with a stellar example by a whole lot of different artists, but really going to deep depth with some of them. But then also Denmark, and then also links across to Japan. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, people talk about collecting being a bit of a disease, but I don't think he had it bad. I think he just
1,600 pots suggests you had it reasonably.
Yeah. But there was more method to it than that. It wasn't hoarding. It was very, very systematic about his acquisitions. Totally recognised the opportunities in market as they came up, and stretched. You know, he really stretched himself at times when there was just essential additions, and of course, you know, if you're in the market for that amount of time, and you're not in a hurry, you can do rather a lot.
But I mean, as you pointed out, he was seemingly very private about this collecting habit. I mean, he was an art dealer and an academic. And was it the fact that he was an art dealer, did that mean that he felt the need not to kind of advertise the fact that he was this avid collector of studio ceramics?
I mean, I found him very open. I mean, because you know, he was somebody that you would have a really interesting, proper, in-depth conversation. You've got some idea of direction, you've got some idea of the kind of bigger ambition as to what it was they were trying to achieve. Kind of invited into this sort of collaborative space where you're working, you feel like you're working with someone, and I know that's not quite the relationship, especially when you're working at auction, but you know, it was an interesting conversation. It was always an interesting conversation to have with John.
What was he trying to achieve?
Well, I think it was ultimately he wanted to have a collection that would enable people to properly see the range of a whole lot of artists that he really appreciated, and to use that to study. I don't think it was a display project necessarily, it was more a study project, and I think that there were certainly times that I remember speaking with him after an auction where he'd just be laughing because he'd say, I can't believe you guys sell this stuff to us, you know, as in the Brits, selling what he saw as
cultural heritage.
Our cultural heritage.
Yeah.
Just
Oh, we sell everything though, don't we? Football clubs, it doesn't matter, we'll sell it.
No, but you know, we have these kind of notional levels where you have to start applying for an export license on things that are over 60-something thousand pounds at the moment, and they've got to be permanently in the UK collection. And anything that doesn't fit those criteria, anyone can have. And that's the area that your dad was operating in. You know, he was got some amazing things that should be really in British museums, but he enjoyed that. That was fun.
So, but it was this what I find kind of intriguing is this academic background, it's this storytelling and the provenance of objects that really intrigued him.
I think it was the discovery that in his mind was an intriguing mind. So he would try to look. I mean, he was one of the preeminent scholars at the Hudson School, which is not terribly well documented, but he really did write the book on the Hudson River School. And I think he just applied that similar sort of thought process to the idea of capturing history in objects.
But I think a lot of collectors, you know, when they're first introduced to an area, when they kind of get to that point where they're emotionally kind of committed to building a collection, because the possibilities are endless, and so a lot of collectors, I think, go into it with a view of setting parameters for what their collection is going to be from the outset, and they go, well, I'm going to focus on this area, or I'm going to focus on this period or these group of artists, and set parameters, because I think otherwise it can be too big, too daunting to even know where to start. Whereas I think John never set parameters for himself. He was infinitely curious, infinitely exploratory, and therefore, you know, he was always open to one pot and one artist, leading him on to the next and leading him on to the next. And I think that's why you build these amazing narratives throughout the collection, because that's how he was approaching the collection as well. I think, yeah, just that sense of, well, if I start collecting Cardi, well, that's what's going to lead me into La Di Quali, because obviously that's a really important part of Cardi's history. And then if we go into La Di Quali, then we're going to go into the other Abuja potteries, and you've got Lami Toto and Hassan Lapai and all of these. And so I think, and he was always open to where that next pot was going to lead him. And it's a really unusual approach and a really brave approach to start down that path, because it can become so wide and so broad so quickly that without having that academic knowledge to apply to it, I think it could lose control quite quickly. And I think his skill was in retaining that control almost while still staying very open.
I mean, it's quite an interesting one, because I guess a very unnuanced interpretation would be to say that there are some tensions in the collection. So between, I don't know, the kind of what is perceived, and we can get into this, as the kind of more traditional aesthetic of Leach, through to there's Karen McNichol up there, who people describe as a postmodernist, and obviously the more obviously modernist Lucy Ree, Hans Koper. Alison, who sat in the front row here, and I had a discussion about whether Leach was in fact a modernist. And Glenn Adamson talks about this in the essay, I think, in the Things of Beauty Growing catalogue. I mean, do you see a relationship? Obviously there was a relationship between the pair of Leach and Ree personally, but is there a relationship in their work, I wonder?
I think probably at the time that John started collecting, there were a couple of really influential books that
Ben, you're speaking very softly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry. Okay.
And you're very interesting, so I want to hear.
So I think at the time that John started to collect, there were a couple of very influential books that kind of grouped together a whole lot of artists as a movement. And there were a lot of people that collected, although on a completely different scale. They would collect a sort of a representative collection that was effectively mimicking the V&A's Oliver Watson book, and then of course there's Paul Rice's book as well, the British Studio Portrait, which is essentially this, a similar kind of survey with a different angle. And I think that there were certainly there was a generation of collector that was coming into the auctions when I started working in the mid-1990s, and that was how we structured the auctions back then. It was very much a historical survey, because that was the way in which a lot of people collected. And I think that changed quite rapidly over that period of time, because I saw that there were collectors that would come in that would focus on, you would have people who would buy a Michael Cardew at the beginning of the sale and a Liz Fritsch at the end of the sale. And I find it very, very difficult to kind of reconcile that. Personally, I could see more obvious links with, say, Michael Cardew and Arts and Crafts Furniture and Liz Fritsch and Op Art, for example. So I thought there were more interesting kind of relevant conversations that were happening outside of the medium. But that seemed to happen quite quickly. So we'd end up in one long auction, let's say a 2-hour evening auction. Whereas we used to have people who would sit throughout the whole event, we would have people that would come in for the pioneer potters, different group of people would turn up and they would be in for the modernist potters in the middle, and then a different group of people at the end to buy the contemporary. And I think that there was a definite change, and I think that most of the more recent collectors tend to be much more narrowly focused on a smaller range of artists with some kind of method of working that appeals to them. Maybe it's a scale. Often people buy a lot of times for a sort of a project. You know, they are, you know, decorating. They're decorating. You know? And it's a very, very relevant reason for people to collect. But it is definitely changed.
Do you ask yourself, as a pair of people in the auction market, why that change happens?
I think perhaps because it's almost become too wide-ranging. Like you say, that the difference between kind of a Leach pot and kind of the more contemporary makers, there's so much variety in between, and I think the ambition to try and form a collection that represents everyone within that range has become almost too wide-ranging, and I think it's harder to live with, like you say, if you have a smaller space and you're having Leach pots next to, maybe just go upstairs and you see the range aesthetically of what's there, and they don't always sit comfortably next to each other. They might have a really interesting academic relationship, or they might even be reacting against each other. That can be a relationship, even if it's not a natural following on from each other, it's almost a reaction to, that's as much a relationship. But they don't necessarily sit comfortably alongside each other. And I think that's part of it. I think earlier on, I think it felt manageable to try and build those kind of fully representative collections, but as time's gone on over the last 20 years, I think it's almost become something that's impossible to start down that route. And so people focus on an area that they instinctively are drawn to, and then concentrate their attention onto that area.
I mean, did you talk to your father about why he collected certain things? Did he go through phases from where you were sat at home? going, oh, isn't an African moment? Is that how it worked?
Well, he would find particular pots that he was obsessed with, and he talked to me about his journey to find some of the pots and what he was looking for. I don't know about specific phases that I would have to think about, you know, but I'm sure he did. But for example, he would tell me about when he visited Ewan Henderson, and he went to look in his cupboard, and he found what he called an unfortunate looking pot.
Sorry, that's quite funny.
Yeah, that was kind of in the back, and you know, probably hidden for a reason. And he pulled it out because he saw in it some evidence that Henderson had been looking at copper, and so that was one of the very early pieces Henderson had ever made, and Dad wanted it, or our father wanted it, and he got it because it had a pivotal moment in time that said something about the evolution of Henderson's artistic journey. That was really important to him. And a lot of times artists might not want to sell those kinds of pieces, but he was after it. And he said he wouldn't necessarily only want that specimen of Henderson. As you can see, the examples of Henderson upstairs, but that's one step in the journey. He felt that was really important to have to show evolution.
He was always seeking a datum point, wasn't he? That's what he described it, which was the earliest point at which you see the artistic language being fully formed. I think sometimes he does it maybe a couple of steps before it's fully formed, but you know, that was his idea, was to establish a datum point, and you fill in beyond that with career highlights. That was the kind of bigger.
But I think that's what he had that insight as well, because he wouldn't start with the key piece. If he came across that really unusual, really early piece, and that's the first one he came across, he was quite happy to start with that. And there might be 10 years between that acquisition and the next acquisition, which would represent the fully formed kind of style of that artist. And so sometimes, it makes you see that it was very much an ongoing project that he'd spent so long doing, because there's a real oddity in the collection. You go, why? If you've only got one piece by this artist, why is that the piece you have in the collection? But it's because that was the approach that he was taking. And it was a journey that he was still on. It wasn't complete. So, you know, there are some pieces there that don't make sense on their own, but had he completed that process, you know, there would have been a really interesting showcase of that artist's evolution.
It's remarkable. He did it all from a distance. I mean, I know he was visiting the UK on a regular basis and Japan, but you know, he did most of that from America. He wasn't Billy's placed at the front of the queue, you know, at every opening and buying. You know, it was a totally different. He didn't tend to have lots of relationships with the artists. He always enjoyed time speaking with the artists, but it wasn't, you know, he wasn't one of those collectors who is absolutely integral to the collecting process to really have a relationship with that artist in the last decades. Really, he wouldn't have been able to do that. It was too broad.
Well, that's really interesting, because that was a question I was about to ask. Whether he travelled, and how often, and would he travel, and I'm going to turn to you about this, Emily, but you might have. Did he travel specifically to go and meet artists? Was that part of his agenda, or, as you say, Ben, was he mainly doing it from the States?
Especially in the beginning, he did do that. As the years went on, things would change. Sometimes he would try, but in 1976, the 24 British Potters exhibition started, which was the big springboard for him and his interest and passion for studio ceramics. And then 1 year later, he was in London and he took out a loan to bring money with him to buy pots. And he went to Albion Views to meet Lucy Reed and knocked on the door, and she answered, and he looked down because he was about a foot taller than her. And she invited him in, and they talked about ceramics for about 1 hour, and he purchased one piece. And then she invited him upstairs for tea and cake, which I guess he might not have known at the time, but that was like very special and didn't happen to everyone.
Wasn't it coffee?
maybe it was coffee.
I think it was coffee.
Glad we're being historically completely accurate. It's important because it's being recorded.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. And when he left, she said, "You just walked out with my best pot." So she saw something in him, and he said he wanted to come back and purchase more. And she said that she's having a kiln opening the following week, and he should come back, which he did. He found his way back up to Albion Mews, and the ceramics were all laid out on the table, and they were still warm from the firing. And he wanted to purchase 2 pieces, but she said he could only purchase 1 piece because she promised the pieces to Peter Dingley, who was an art dealer at the time. And but she said, "You can call him up, maybe he'll sell it to you," which he did, and said, "Sure, come on, come and take a look." And this was 1977, so there were no cell phones. He took a train up to Dingley's gallery, but there was some train trouble, so he was pretty late. By the time he got to the gallery, it was closed, but there was a note on the window that said, "Come meet me at my house, here's the address," which he did. So he found his way to his home, and they were having dinner, but it happened to be cow's brains, which my father was from the Midwest and had a very basic palate at that time. Well, probably was not expecting that, but
don't have to be from the Midwest not to expect that, just to be clear.
Okay. Yeah, it wasn't his typical palate, but he said, "You know what?" He said to himself, "I want this pot, and I don't want to offend Peter Dingley, so I'm going to do what I have to do." But they had a very lovely evening, and in the end, he did purchase the pot. So I think that story just illustrates his passion for ceramics, and that was the first time he came here, and the lengths that he'll go to try to purchase a piece that he can't get out of his head.
He loved the pot so much he ate cow brain. Excellent. You wouldn't have got that story from Simon, by the way, which I think is worth pointing out. I mean, can we talk a little bit about the economics of some of this? I'm intrigued by it, because obviously this is like the sequel to the first show that was in November, which broke 28 records and was, I've got the figures, 228% over the pre-sale estimates. What's going on in the ceramics world? Why is ceramics suddenly having this, or is it sudden?
I don't think it's a sudden thing. I think it's been a growing thing generally anyway, certainly over the last 5 years in particular. But I think you can't get past how important and the excitement that builds around the narrative of a single owner collection. And so I think it was a real moment in time. It's an opportunity with this collection that won't come around again. And I think, especially with something like this, where we've been able to be so selective with which works we've brought together and presented at a time, that we've been able to build all those stories together. So I think it will be a massive boost to the ceramics market, and I think we'll feel the impact on it for years to come. But I think it's just helping to accelerate a trajectory that was already there, very much so.
But then I'm going to go back to why that trajectory started in the first place in that case.
I think there's a huge amount of factors involved in that one.
We've got time.
I think it depends entirely on the artists. I mean, there are different market forces at work with each different artist. And what we were able to do with John's collection, because it was so broad, was to have this kind of build a momentum in the sale where we were really being very selective from much bigger groups and being able to tell lots of stories about the pots that engaged people that were coming to view. It looked beautiful in the catalogue, it looked beautiful in the sale room, and there were definitely things in there which were unique opportunities to buy. There were a lot of unique opportunities to buy, and the market tends to respond to that. It can be frustrating at times that people that have long-term collecting ambitions all of a sudden find themselves completely outgunned by a billionaire with a sideboard to fill. but you know, it's a very real factor in that market, and I think, yeah, like I say, each different artist has a completely different market condition. But it wasn't a massive sale in terms of the quantity of lots. It was 67 or something.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of diversity in there. But we were trying to personalise it with the selections. Obviously, you know, I've always felt that with each artist there's a certain capacity for the market to absorb. And so you may feel, and actually some artists, they do better when you've got more of their work in a sale than less, because it focuses people's attention.
You've got greater pull, I think.
But then the catalogue layout and the way that we were trying to kind of choreograph a sale, where we were creating moments of discussion between pots and potters, just really worked well as a document, and I think it just captured the imagination of people that weren't previously bidding, plus all of those that had been before.
I mean, there were stories. The story that the press picked up on for the first sale was because they're journalists, we tend to do this kind of thing, that the pot that Hans Koper swapped for the goats. Are there stories like that upstairs that we should be looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few pots like that. Probably not something that's quite as charming as the goat pot.
No other fun
no trades for that. But I mean, I think there was an element where we were very much focusing on those kind of narrative pots and those kind of real folklore pots for the Art of Fire sale. That's very much what we were trying to do, because it was such an important part of John's own process for which pots he was going after, and so that was kind of very much our focus for that first selection. But there's, like, for example, there's the kind of the Bernard Leach bowl, the early bowl from 1923, that incorporates a kind of almost like a version of Hamader's seal on the inside of the well, and Simon's spoken about the importance of this piece because it was a piece that Bernard Leach gifted to Hamader when he then returned to Japan, and was in Hamader's personal collection. And he's talked about the symbolism of having Hamader's seal on the centre of the bowl, in the same way that Hamader was central to Bernard Leach's own work, and the significance of the relationship that the two had together. So, you know, it's something that's kind of very much a personal piece. It's probably not the most beautiful of Bernard's works by any means, but it's just such a personal pot, and a really beautiful symbol of the relationship between Leach and Hamader. So there's definitely still kind of other pieces like that in the collection.
The cow brain piece isn't upstairs.
Not that we know.
I mean, is it curious, I have to ask, is it curious watching this collection being dispersed? How does it make you feel?
Yeah, it is. It's a lot of emotions, but my sister Jillian, who's in the audience here, we're making a film about his collection. So while it might not be together physically forever, it is documented. We're making a film to document the stories of the collection and how they overlap with each other across time and space and geography. And Ben and Marijke are wonderfully in the documentary. And I also think it's interesting about collections, because they come together for a period of time and then they disperse. So they live together, they have a conversation together, and then they go on to be enjoyed by other people and have other relationships. So it's a lot of feelings, but it's really nice to see people who are so passionate get more enjoyment out of them.
I mean, Glenn Adamson wrote a piece where he talked about your father would have enjoyed the fact that his pots were being dispersed, that giving joy to other people. Do you think that's true?
I do think that's true, because he did, as Ben said, view it as a study collection, and he wanted people to continue enjoying them and learning from them. So I agree.
And Ben, you talked about John treating pots like books, which I quite like. Yeah, you did. That's the research I did in Costa.
There's certainly a lot of stories that were associated with pots that were actually, some of them were discoveries to us. I'm not, because John didn't really manage to capture, in the way that he was hoping, all of those stories. And so when we started researching them, we really going into depth and back through the old catalogues, and that's when the stories that were associated with pots often came to view, and with provenances and other things that were coming from the same collections at the same time. There was an awful lot of research that was done.
I think we both felt quite a strong responsibility to try and tell some of those stories and capture some of those stories that he hadn't managed to document himself yet, and make sure that we kind of, did justice to what he was trying to do with the collection.
But the analysis of an individual pot, you have to really try and kind of focus on what I think. You can't just look at it on an aesthetic basis of what's in front of you, because you're not necessarily obliged to like the object. But you need to be able to understand it, you need to be able to take it apart, you need to be able to try and work out how successful it is in the range of what that artist was trying to do. So Leach was very good about creating this entire language of interpretation of Leach's own pots, and pots that were made by people who were, a follower of Leach. But that method of analysis of a pot, and critiquing an object, was completely irrelevant to a lot of the potters that followed. And so that kind of idea of Leach being the dominant force in pre-war analysis, not just sort of politically, but in a way that there was sort of an expectation for pots to be looked at using a kind of a Leach method of analysis, hasn't really, because everything has become so diverse, there isn't a single follow-on. There are lots of different treatises on how to look at pots, but I believe you've got to look at the artist, you've got to really embed yourself in that artist's work, see a big range of it, and then try and place that object in front of you within a context, in that context.
I'm very keen, because I'm sure, having seen the hands all go up, that there are probably people with lots of more erudite questions than the one I've managed to ask this evening. But as a kind of coda for me, is there a pot upstairs that you have a particular desire for, Ben?
That's a few. That's a few.
I can't accept a few.
So I love the Ewan Henderson saxophone.
No, that's
that's
mine. Sorry.
But I do love it. I think it's a really, really strong piece. It's such a graphic pot. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And today, actually seeing it for the first time, there's an enormous lidded caddy by Richard Batron. It's in the back over there. That I just felt was so powerful. But it was also such a sort of a human pot. You could just tell so much about the person that made that from looking at that object. And it was, I think it's the scale of it. As I said, I hadn't seen it in person until I saw it today. But this is just a wonderful thing. Yeah, really wonderful.
Marijke?
I'm fighting Ben for the Ewan
You're
Henderson.
fighting Ben for the Ewan Henderson. That should be exciting.
Pistols at dawn.
No, we'll sell tickets. That will be subscribe on Sky to that one, which I'm looking forward to. Emily, do you have a favourite? I mean, it's a really hard question.
It's a really hard question, but I mean, I love Maak Contemporary's spade forms and how he put so much power into a form, a small form, like a little smaller spade form up there. But I also love Godfrey and the goblet in the whimsical pieces. So, and I love the Mary Rogers, how they do sea creatures. So a range.
A range.
Yeah, a lot of different.
We'll let you have a range. The other two had to name one, but you can have a range. That's okay. Do we have questions? I think we'll take 5 minutes of questions if people have a question. If not, I'm sure. Is there more champagne upstairs? Prosecco upstairs. There's more Prosecco upstairs if you'd like to buttonhole them up there. But if you would like to ask a question, then you're more than welcome to. Hello, Alison.
I'm sorry to be busting in again.
No, that's fine. What I would say, could you almost holler this question, because there's no microphones, there are people behind you.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'll try. I was going to ask how you decided what you put in the first sale and what you put in the second sale.
That's a really good question, one I wish I'd asked myself. Did everybody hear that? Yes. Excellent.
I think we touched on it slightly in the sense that we were looking for the pots that really carried that narrative, I think, in the first instance.
Does that mean they're the best ones?
Not always. I mean, I think often the two went hand in hand, but it wasn't always about that, and it wasn't always about. Sometimes the narrative was more important than the pot. Had it not been a major pot, but the narrative was really strong, I think we'd have still selected it for that first sale. I mean, if you look at the Lucy B cup and saucer as a case in point, you know, it's not by far it wasn't the most important as a major work by Lucy B, but it was such a significant piece because it represented such a specific point in time for Lucy B's output, for kind of European modernism in itself, but also the narrative of it, and the fact that, you know, this is a piece that, one of the few pieces that she carried in her suitcase when she fled Austria and was coming over.
Oh, it's a red cup and saucer.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. So, you know, it wasn't a major Lucy B by any stretch of the imagination, but the narrative of that was so significant that there was no way we weren't ever going to select that for that sale, because that's what we were trying to do.
We were also trying to not just represent the artist, but the collector as well, trying to reflect what it was that he was trying to do, the things that particularly interested him. There is, within the collection, there's a great deal of depth in certain areas, and there's other areas where it's a bit, you know, it's lighter, and he's probably going to come back and, you know, and add more. But we were very much trying to personalise it, trying to, trying to show what it was that excited him as an individual. And Marijke's got a plan for contextualising the rest of the collection over the next few auctions. There's more to come.
There is more to come.
More to come. Do we have any more questions? We've had the difficult first question. Yes, sir.
If I can ask Emily a question, please. I know it's an emotional thing. Obviously, your sister's here. And do you have a brother?
No.
So you mentioned that coat and spade, very close to the one that was sold in the first sale at Phillips. And you mentioned that the goblet, Ian Godfrey and Mary Rogers. But have you been able to keep some pots for yourselves without having them to be dispersed? And your sister?
We have a couple, but you know,
which is nice, because you wouldn't want to have to.
Right. Yeah. But you know, we didn't want to pick the best pieces, because those we wanted them to go to really good homes that would appreciate it. But we were able to keep a couple pieces that, you know, we loved as children, you know, in our childhood.
There's enough to go around.
You mentioned the casualty in the earlier years. Were those casualties saved and restored?
Casualty?
The breakage.
You know, I don't know, because it was so long ago. I have to.
They might not have been restored, but they were definitely saved.
Yeah,
he saved everything.
Like a museum repair. So it's still nice to have the elements and the.
That's true.
The intimacy and the emotion still there, isn't it? Even though it's stuck back together.
No, he did. If there were broken pieces, I mean, there was one piece that was shipped to him that he purchased that arrived in pieces, but he kept it. Like everything was important to him, and he cataloged everything. So, I'm sure maybe we could find it in the storage.
It sounds like you passed that down to you both.
Yeah.
The caring, and the curatorship is, if you like, which is a nice legacy, isn't it?
Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the lovely legacies actually is that the family donated lots of archival materials to the Craft Study Centre.
Sorry, Ben,
sorry. So one of the lovely things is the family donated all of the archival material that associates with Leach, and there's some amazing letters between Leach and Lucy Ree that are being donated to the Craft Study Centre. So they are in the process of adding that to the inventory at the moment. But it's a great legacy, because it makes perfect sense in that placement. Yeah.
Maybe take one more question. If there's there's loads of hands going up now.
I just was intrigued to see that this was not a Strata collection. I mean, he still was collecting, you know, these are pieces that he bought in 2020 and all the rest of it. What was he particularly, or do you know what he was particularly interested in at that time, so late? I mean, so many collections sort of get to a point and then they seem to go flat.
Okay, so I think we talked about it a bit before, where John would spot opportunities in the market. So there are some pieces up there in the Vise and Murray cabinet, for example, that were bought actually just a couple of weeks before his death, unfortunately, and he never saw them, never received them. But they came from a really famous collection, Darrell Fromm's collection, which was being offered at Woolley and Wallace, and I went and inspected them on his behalf and purchased them, but sadly he didn't receive them. But it's about opportunity. So, you know, Darrell Fromm had an amazingly well-researched collection, and so he was adding several layers of provenance to each individual item, applying titles to historic pots, and that was exactly the sort of thing that John would kind of really pay attention to. But that happened at regular intervals all the way through 20 years plus auction.
He was going back to Phil Hurl's, I think. When he came to visit in the studio, he was talking about wanting to go back on his own collection and, you know, fill gaps that he sort of had missed or whatever.
Well, he always felt he was light on Murray, you see, so that was an opportunity to really fill it with some really important Murrays that had properly been researched, quality pieces.
But he was always this sort of kindest, most generous, an extraordinary man.
I feel like we're all friends now. Should we go upstairs and have some more of Marijke's bubbling?
Yeah,
which just leads me to say thank you, you for coming, thank you very much. But also if we can thank Ben, Marijke and particularly Emily, who came at very short notice. That would be wonderful. Thank you very much.